this evening will be first that Justice Virginia Bell of the High Court of Australia will give a general introduction. Justice Bell will be followed by Professor Adrienne Stone of Melbourne Law School, where she is also a Kathleen Fitzpatrick Australian Laureate Fellow, a Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor and Director of the Centre for Comparative Constitutional Studies. Professor Stone will say something of the public law speeches and papers in the book. Professor Stone will be followed by Professor Gino Dal Ponte. He's a professor at the School of Law at the University of Tasmania, where he teaches in equity and trusts, legal ethics and tax. Professor Dal Ponte will speak about some of the other speeches and papers of the book. He will be followed by Professor Rob Pascoe, Dean Laureate and Professor of History at Victoria University, Melbourne. And then Robert French will speak last before the formal launch by Justice Bell. So I now hand over to Justice Bell, who's with me here in the engine room, I should say.
Thanks indeed, Alan. Can I say what an honour it is and a delight to participate in this launch of this very handsome collection of Robert French's papers and speeches. It would have been even more delightful if the launch were able to be conducted in the old-fashioned way, where we all gathered together and you could buy a copy of the book on the spot, and after the speeches we could all share a glass of something very like champagne. In these COVID-constrained times, I know that we have to be grateful for the availability of the Zoom platform, but for my part, and without any disrespect to the IT industry, I have not myself found the Zoom drink to be a particularly satisfying experience. Having said that, I had the distinct pleasure of serving on the High Court with Chief Justice French for just on 8 years. Throughout that time, he maintained an exhausting schedule of extracurricular speaking engagements. These ranged from the patron's address that Alan just referred to a speech on the theme of complexity and moral certainty in the law, which he delivered at the Mildura in 2013 to the Murray Mallee Country Community Legal Service. Chief Justice French conceived it as an important part of his role to stimulate in the widest possible audience awareness of and respect for the essential elements of our legal system and institutions of government. As he explained in this connection in one of the essays in the book, the spaces left by lack of awareness and misunderstanding are all too readily filled by snake oil salesmen coming in from the hinterland of our civil and political discourses. Professor Pascoe has a wealth of material from which to distill in just some slim 400 pages a representative sample of Bob French's remarkable output. As you've heard, Professor Pascoe has grouped the papers in the collection into 10 themes ranging from human rights and access to justice through to competition law. Each part is introduced by a commentary, as Alan has explained. The public law part includes a paper titled The Constitution and the People. It was first published in 2003 as one of the essays in the collection edited by Jeff Lindell and Cheryl Saunders. Professor Toomey, in her commentary on the public law part, points out that this was a paper that proved particularly influential in the later jurisprudence of the High Court. In it, Bob French embraced the idea of the people who united in the one indissoluble federal commonwealth had over the years since Federation, come to be the ultimate repository of sovereignty. Another focus in that influential paper was the singular position of Indigenous Australians in our polity. His Honour started from the point that authority makes clear that there cannot be conflicting claims to sovereignty. Nonetheless, His Honour proposed that the model of recognition derived from the common law of native title might be suggestive of an approach to an agreement between the Commonwealth and Indigenous communities which does not involve any compromise of sovereignty. He envisaged such an agreement as recognising and acknowledging the traditional law and customs of Indigenous communities and their historical relationship with their country. A cultural reality which he suggested could be accepted without compromise to our identity as a nation. When Robert French took up appointment as Chief Justice, these were issues about which he brought a wealth of experience and of thinking that he had developed over the course of his professional life. Together with Fred Chaney and John Toohey, Bob French was one of the founders of the Aboriginal Legal Service of Western Australia, and later, as a judge of the Federal Court of Australia, he was of course appointed as the inaugural president of the National Native Title Tribunal. At his swearing in as Chief Justice of Australia, he acknowledged the presence in court that day of a number of members of the Ngunnawal people, stressing that his acknowledgement of their presence was no mere platitude, that recognition of the long history of Australia's Indigenous people was becoming, if it had not already become, part of our national identity. For those of us who were present on that occasion, it was quite a moment. Professor Megan Davis writes the commentary on the Indigenous Issues section of the collection. She describes in that commentary the impact on her of an article published in the Sydney Morning Herald in 2009 by Chief Justice French. In the article, he discussed the possibility of an agreement between the Commonwealth and Indigenous communities of the kind that he had proposed in the 2003 paper. Professor Davis was completing her doctoral thesis at the time at the ANU University. She says that she cut out the article and she carried it with her as a reminder to her, as an Aboriginal public lawyer, that she should keep faith with the institutions that she'd studied. As she puts it, Bob French's career, judicial work and extracurricular writings have provided great succour to Indigenous leaders and to her. It impressed me when I read the commentary as no small tribute to a Chief Justice of Australia. I'm pleased to see that Professor Pascoe has included among the papers Bob French's relatively recent and sterling defence of the principle of legality. It was delivered at a symposium at Cambridge University a couple of years ago. The principle, as he points out, was encapsulated in 1805 in United States and Fisher by no less a light than Chief Justice Marshall. Notwithstanding its impeccable credentials, it's a principle that, it must be said, has had more than its share of contemporary critics. Bob French endeavours in his paper to settle the fluttering in the dovecotes by acknowledging that supporting the principle by recourse to notions of presumed legislative intention may well be a little at odds with reality. His point is that presumed legislative intention is surplus to needs. When the text of a statute leaves open a choice of constructions, the purported ascertainment of legislative intention, which on orthodox principles is expressed in the text, is effectively indistinguishable from the act of decision to choose a preferred construction. The protective approach of the common law of statutory construction with respect to rights, freedoms and long-established principles has what Bob French describes as a small c constitutional character that serves as proof against the ebb and flow of populist tides. Unsatisfactory, he says, as it may be to a tidy mind, he embraces the principle of legality as a judicial damage control mechanism that is, he points out, compatible with representative democracy and with the ultimate supremacy of Parliament, given that the common law in its constitutional character cannot propel courts across the boundary that separates judicial and legislative function. I cannot leave the launch without some reference to the title of the collection, The Tuning Symbol. It shares with Jesting Pilot, the title of the anthology of Sir Owen Dixon's papers, a somewhat recherche quality. Each is drawn from the writings of Sir Francis Bacon, who numbered among his many distinctions that he was Lord Chancellor under King James I. In 1612, Bacon wrote, "Patience and gravity of hearing is an essential part of justice, and an over-speaking judge is no well-tuned symbol." Lord Denning quoted this aphorism in Jones and the National Coal Board, in which, with much hand-wringing, the Court of Appeal overturned the decision of Mr Justice Hallett, who, having intervened too frequently in the course of cross-examination, was found to be the very model of an over-speaking judge. While the general effect of the aphorism is clear, I do feel obliged to point out that the symbol is a musical instrument without a defined pitch, and for that reason, symbols are neither in tune nor out of tune. It would be a pardonable error in a jobbing Lord Chancellor, but it is disconcerting in the man who has come down to us as the father of empiricism and the inventor of scientific method. With that small quibble, if I may pass over to Professor Stone to speak in a little more depth about the public law aspects of the collection.
Thank you very much, Justice Bell. And can I say how honoured I am to be asked to speak at this launch. The Well-Tuned Symbol is a fascinating collection of essays, and as Justice Bell has just canvassed, they traverse a wide range of legal themes. I've been asked to comment on the public law aspects of the essays, and for that reason my attention fell first to the 5 essays in Part D of the volume which are headed Public Law. And I might just pause here to compliment the editor on the way in which the collection is arranged. It is the 5 public law essays are accompanied by a wonderful commentary from Professor Anne Toomey, and each other section has also its own commentary, and together we get a wonderful sense both of the vision of His Honour also a leading thinker in the field, and it's a particularly rich collection in that respect. Now, the essays in Part D of the volume are themselves very diverse. The Constitution and the People, the essay to which Justice Bell has already referred, considers the source of the authority of the Constitution and the nature of the people with whom it rests. The second essay, The Chief Justice and the Governor-General, canvasses the relationship between these 2 great officers, including the controversy of 1975. The third essay focuses on reason-giving and administrative decision-making. The fourth, a particular favourite mine, The Globalisation of Public Law, a quilting, addresses the use of comparative law in public law decision-making. And the final essay on the very important principle of legality. So these essays provide themselves a rich array of delights for public lawyers. But I should say there are many other essays in the collection with clear connections to public law, and I'm thinking in particular of the essays in the comparative law section, on judges in the academy, on the profession and the judicial system. Indeed, if I may just be indulged with one comment on the collection as a whole, one of the pleasures of the collection is to see the work of a single mind on a diverse way of issue, such a diverse array of issues, a mind that's alive to and adept at illustrating the connectedness of them. But focusing principally on the 5 essays in the public law section of the volume, I'd like to draw out a number of overriding characteristics. And the first is prescience, or at least an eye for and a willingness to focus on the really big issues. Now, so many of the issues that were written about sometimes several decades ago remain at the forefront of our public debate. Justice Bell has already mentioned the influence and the prescience of His Honour's views on the authority of the Constitution and its connection to the question of Indigenous sovereignty. But the essays on the administrative state are equally important, and it was fascinating for me to see, of course, the emergence of proportionality analysis, which remains at the centre of the High Court's work. Beyond prescience, these are a set of essays that are distinguished by learning. The essays are historical, legal, and jurisprudential. In the realm of public law, the essays place the Constitution carefully in its historical context and trace the history of administrative decision-making in Australia as well as elsewhere, particularly in the United Kingdom. The essays are equally comfortable with jurisprudence, as well of course, including immensely learned exposition of an analysis of the law. Now, there is also what Anne Toomey in her commentary referred to as a dash of science, which I particularly enjoyed. His Honour refers to the traditional view that the Constitution should be interpreted as a statute of the Imperial Parliament, commenting that such a view is comprehensible in a Newtonian universe, but that the universe of the Constitution, like the physical universe, has developed from a Newtonian universe to something more complex. This impressive breadth and depth of learning is, however, worn lightly. History, legal theory, legal exegesis, and even science do not obscure ideas behind an impressive, really illuminate. They render complex ideas more readily understandable and enjoyable. And can I say this clarity of method is a more general characteristic of His Honour's writing that I have always enjoyed, and can I say was really much appreciated also by my students. The third quality is balance. The essays carefully account for arguments before and against a proposition, even though themselves presenting a clear argument. Thus, His Honour sees the power of the argument that the authority of the Constitution is grounded in its enactment of the Imperial Parliament, while at the same time the continued authority of the Constitution lies in its acceptance by the people. Also illustrative of this aspect of His Honour's vision of judging is that it is one in which law is taken very seriously, but not thought to resolve all questions. The essay on administrative decision-making both insists that rationality is central to the legality of administrative action, but does not equate a rational decision with a correct decision, and accepts in any event that rationality has its limits. And lastly, the vision of law and judging is moderated by fundamental good sense. Oliver Wendell Holmes' aphorism that the life of the law has not been logic but experience is both quoted and well understood. Under this, I think, lies an admirably plural and modest political or moral vision. These essays do not appeal to universal absolutes, but recognise that reasonable minds can differ, that our understanding of the law, and particularly of the Constitution, can change between place and time, and that change is both inevitable and desirable. Indeed, I think the essays show an affinity with another Holmesian aphorism, that time has upset many fighting faiths. I do not think it is quoted, but it seems to be very much part of its animating spirit. We see, therefore, a powerful combination of principle and pragmatism, learning and common sense, intellectual rigour and intellectual humility. This is a well indeed. I recommend the essays to all. I congratulate the distinguished author and editor. Thank you very much.
I think now, if we could hear from Professor Gino Del Ponte.
Thank you, Judge. It's very much likewise a privilege to have been asked to provide a brief commentary concerning aspects of the Academy's compilation of some of Mr. French's papers and speeches over an illustrious legal career in this book called The Tuning Symbol. Although originally asked to say some words regarding its private law components, as there's no segment dedicated to private law in the abstract, I hope you'll forgive me for focusing on chapters targeting the legal profession and legal education. To my way of thinking, Mr. French has expressed views and broader attitudes to the roles of the legal profession and the functions of legal education provide a valuable insight into the actors that influence and in many ways shape the law and legal process. Let me commence with reference to Chapter 6, provocatively titled, "Don't You Know Who I Am? Ego and Identity in the Administration of Justice." This may be seen to be playing to a perceived characteristic of some lawyers. After all, it's not a profession regularly populated by shrinking violets, and intensifying competition has hardly been productive of a downplaying of egos. Yet Chapter 6 presents a flip side. It partly emanates out of Mr. French's first civil trial in the Supreme Court of Western Australia, involving a dispute, of all things, over a horse. The dispute being between its owner, the plaintiff, represented by Mr. French, and its trainer, who was unrepresented in the proceedings. Mr. French's client lost the case. And Mr. French writes, and I quote, "The sting of losing my first civil case in a superior court to an unrepresented horse trainer did not break my spirit. But it was," he recalls, "an event that contributed to what he describes as harsh modesty, the flip side adverted to above." Now, the foregoing leads Mr. French to locate the law in inverted commas and the process and principles underscoring it above the identity of who argues the case itself. He concludes the speech in question by remarking that while who we are is relevant because it properly informs our advocacy and our judging, how we do the job according to well-established standards of integrity and excellence is much more important. It's a theme to which Mr. French returns in Chapter 7, titled, "It's Not Whether You Win or Lose, ... Again, there emerges what some may perceive as the tension, or perhaps we should view it in terms of intersection, between skillful advocacy on the one hand and the dictates of the rule of law on the other. Here he identifies what others may term, hopefully not too frequently, the mismatch between justice and the law, explaining the point as follows, page 95. "Judges occasionally find themselves constrained by the law to make decisions that have harsh or unfair results, or unable to make decisions that can be tailored precisely to the justice of the case. In the end, however, our adherence to the rule of law serves larger and more enduring values than that of the avoidance of transient unpopularity and unhappiness with the result." Of course, this is not to say that the profession must sit by and accept with both hands tied behind its back unfair or unjust outcomes by being constrained by a perception that the long game espoused by the rule of law should automatically prevail. In the very next sentence, Mr. French observes that when the law is inadequate to the requirements of justice, it's the profession in particular that's in a position to advocate change, and indeed has a public duty to do so. After all, as Mr. French notes in the ensuing chapter, titled "Singers of Songs and Dreamers of Plays," every contending argument in every case is a statement about where the justice of the case, according to law, is to be found. In turn, every judicial decision declares the answer, as best the judge can give it, to the question, what does the doing of justice according to law require of me in this case? When it comes to the presentation of these contending arguments, under the auspices of the encompassing rule of law, there's no doubt scope for boldness in advocacy. In some instances, it's bound up in duty. Mr. French notes, and I quote, It's hard to visualise Robert Menzies as a precocious 28-year-old counsel arguing the engineers' case in the High Court, being told from the bench, as legend would have it, that he was talking utter nonsense, but in response uttering that he was compelled to speak nonsense by the prior decisions of that very court. Being granted leave to attack those prior decisions, Mr. French observes, Menzies seized the moment, and as we say, the rest is indeed history. The anecdote provides a strong foundation for the following chapter, going under the title Legal Change, the Role of Advocates. And this is being the text of the Samaras Byers lecture delivered in 2016. It commences with an interesting aside, namely a statement by Samaras to Mr. French as they were preparing for the hearing in Kawata and Bioki Peterson in 1982. Samaras said, "They're just chaps, Bob, just chaps." Today, Samaras might have added, "and chapettes," which I'm told is the feminine version of chaps. But rather than being intended as disrespectful to the justices, then presiding over the court, perhaps this reflected the equality between individuals and thus egos, while acknowledging differences in roles. Chapter 10, titled Seeking Higher Things in Higher Education, the case of the lawyers, encapsulates much of the foregoing by focusing on lawyers' dedication to a higher calling. It's no surprise here that Mr. French should cite an ethical dimension. He writes, "Lawyers are not ethical neuters," before referring to, and I quote, "a gaze fixed steadily on higher things and a deep commitment to seeking justice for the client." Nor should it be a surprise, perhaps, that this should serve as a springboard for him to conclude this chapter by resorting to a Catholic role, not in the religious sense, for legal education. He expresses the following view, which certainly deserves quotation. "A higher education which exposes the student to perceptions larger than those offered by the positivists exposes him or her not just to higher things, but to larger things. It takes the student outside the system that's being studied and invites him or her to look back at it and judge, to observe where it's lacking, to accept that change is possible and that lawyers can help bring it about." With this backdrop, Mr. French has returned to the point in the final chapter of the book, entitled Legal Education in Australia, a never-ending story, is hardly unheralded. He proffers the opinion, and I quote, "A law graduate without a sense of different conceptions of justice and its relationship to the rule of law goes into the world with a patch over one eye." Here he could alternatively have cited the words of St. Paul, "seeing through a glass, but darkly." But more broadly, in conclusion, without the commitment of judges and lawyers to the pursuit of justice informed by the rule of law, Mr. French's book reminds us that we cannot visualise the bigger picture. And while drummers might prove unable to genuinely tune their cymbals, the themes within this important book clearly resonate.
Thank you very much, Professor Del Pont. Regrettably, as some of you may be aware, the editor of the tuning symbol, Professor Robert Pascoe, is having a few internet difficulties and he is joining us by telephone. So with that added limitation, can I call on Professor Pascoe now to address us?
Certainly. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. We've switched from one provider to another provider. So we are caught like a trapeze artist between two places, and we are hovering, between in hyperspace. And so I'm terribly sorry. But I'm speaking from Boonwurrung country in South Yarra in Melbourne, and where the internet's always bad, and tonight's particularly bad. Can I just begin by saying what a wonderful project this was for me personally, because I've known Bob for many years, and in fact, he was my lawyer when I was a young, troubled academic, getting into all kinds of bother. And let me just assure you that I can recommend him as a very good lawyer. The Academy's done a brilliant job. And can I just say, the editorial committee and Kevin, who just nagged until we got it all done, fantastic people to work with. The Federation Press, the editorial people there, including Kathleen Fitzhenry, incredibly easy people to work with. And I've been involved in 36 books. This was by far one of the easiest ones because of the incredible support I got from both the Academy and from the press. The book's really important. I mean, we're gathered in very difficult times, very troubling times, not just the pandemic, not just the problems in the United States, the problems around the world. And I think what this tells us is that lawyers are more important than ever. The legal profession, the judiciary, notions of law and justice, things that Bob has been talking about his whole life, are actually suddenly front and centre, critical to democracy, critical to how we're going to navigate the 21st century. And so we saw this book pretty early on as a book which might inspire young people to choose law as a profession and to understand the law in the way that the previous speakers have just talked about, not wearing an eye patch, to use Gino's lovely metaphor, not some of the things that Bob says in the book itself. To think about the book as trying to inspire people to actually think about the issues that Bob is talking about, or has been talking about his whole life. And so we thought the way we could do that was, first of all, to thematise it, then secondly, to bring in the commentators. Now, commentators in legal historical tradition obviously often mean something different, and Blackstone's commentaries and so on. But we meant in this book, as you've all quickly worked out, something quite different, which was that we didn't want to hear the voice, as Bob put it himself, of a single white man of non-Indigenous background droning on, page after page about the law. What we wanted was to have his words refracted, if you will, through the intelligence of the commentators, and they've all done a brilliant job in trying to show us how Bob's words have meaning for their individual lives. So we wanted to see the profession in totality. We wanted to have citizens who were male, female, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, Singaporeans as well as Australians, practitioners as well as scholars, a whole kind of, if you like, a cornucopia of combined intelligence, listening to Bob and commenting on Bob's ideas. And I think it's a model that we could use in other contexts. I know a lot of people here tonight are probably near retirement, and you probably have ideas about how you want to present your life's work to young people. But also in the older academies, the Academy of Social Sciences, the Academy of Humanities, with which I'm much better acquainted, these older academies could learn from this. They could sort of say, well, we can actually produce not just a traditional festschrift, but a book like this, which really lifts people up and gives people to understand what these elderly folks have been doing their entire working lives. So my Vice Chancellor, whom some of you would know, Peter Dawkins, is retiring this week. And on Thursday, we're meeting to talk about a book like this for him. And we're going to go through his career, and we're going to use this book as a model for how we can present the ideas of an economist in the form of Peter Dawkins, whose economics is about, quite complex issues, but issues that are really quite relevant to the future of tertiary education in particular in Australia. So Bob's book, I think, can be a model for parallel volumes where we try to inspire young people to take up the burdens, whether it be in law, economics, or whatever field we might be talking about. And I think that it will connect with young people. And although we think we're living in troubled times, I think the times ahead for young people in the 21st century are going to be even tougher than they are for us today. And that's why we need to produce intelligent, compassionate people in areas like the law. So I congratulate the Academy for this, and I think it's a wonderful model for the other academies to learn from, and perhaps for other lawyers to think about putting their own life's work into similar kind of volumes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pascoe. And now I think it's time to hear from the man himself. Bob?
You're on mute.
Bob, you're on mute.
I have been sitting in virtual arbitration hearings for the last few weeks, and the most frequently used expression is "please unmute." So it's delightful to be here in the presence of colleagues and friends from the Academy. In Perth with me are my wife Valerie, who refuses to appear on screen because she's in gym gear, and our sons Rob and Tom. Our third son Andy is in London, where he's enjoying the restrictions of lockdown, along with Desmond Brown, who I'm delighted to see has got up early to join us. And we're also, I'm very pleased to see, we're joined on screen by my sister Rebecca Wilson and her husband Peter. Rob has already spoken of the work of the Academy in bringing this volume together, and that reflects, I think, the mission of the Academy, which is try to generate dialogue, intersection, interaction between the different branches of the profession and between the profession and the Academy. And the academic contributions to this text, which I hugely value and for which I thank the commentators, reflect that mission. Virginia passed some querulous comment about the title, Tuning Symbol. This was the subject of intense discussion between members of the steering committee and myself, and particularly Brian O'Peskin, with whom I exchanged quite a number of emails about it. As a rigorous search of the internet will show, it is possible at the moment to purchase things called symbol tuners. They're little weights you put on a symbol and it alters the pitch. And there's quite a trade in those. But more importantly, there is a factory in China which has been manufacturing symbols since the 19th century, and one of the last things they do in the manufacturing process is to tune the symbol. Now, but anyway, Virginia, I hope that assists in overcoming your doubts about this title. As some of you might have read in Kevin Lindgren's opening remarks, the origin of the term, where I was accused by the Attorney General of Fiji of being an over-speaking judge and not a well-tuned symbol, because of a piece I wrote in the Australian about the role of Australian judges on the Fiji Supreme Court, and how we would continue with our commissions under the pre-coup government but not accept commissions from the new government. But so that gave me the idea for the title, and I'm delighted that the AAL and Federation Press were prepared to take the risk and accept it. May I thank, firstly, of course, Alan Robertson and Kevin Lindgren for the leadership that they provided in bringing this volume to fruition, and also in accepting the proposition that it would be good to have these commentary essays in. I did say, probably insulting a whole lot of people without knowing it, that there's nothing more tedious than the collected speeches of retired judges, and that one wanted to try and leaven the prose a bit by some different perspectives. And of course, that fitted nicely with the theme mission of the Academy. Whenever I gave away copies of this book, and I gave away quite a number, which I inflicted on my siblings and other members of my family and friends, I did write in the front of it, you don't have to read the whole thing. I was pleased that Virginia gave the sort of launch that I really value with her overview remarks. Launching a book is a serious ethical challenge. The first question is, do you actually have to read it from cover to cover? And the answer to that is no, as long as you have a good grasp of what the contents are. The second thing is, what sort of things can you say about books, particularly a book which you don't warm to? Let us suppose that a book is of the kind that consists of turgid prose from cover to cover, and nobody would ever read it from beginning to end. Then one can use the term I've often found useful, a rich resource, to be explored by the readers. Virginia, I was delighted to see, did not resort to that term, so thank you. Incidentally, could I mention while I'm speaking that I noticed that Michael Kirby had joined us among the listed participants, and I should mention that in opening, and thank you very much, Michael, for coming along. Michael was silly enough to write to me about the book, and so I sent him a copy. Whether he's read it from cover to cover, I don't know, but I thank him for taking it on. My thanks also to Gino Del Ponte and Adrian Stone for their very thoughtful remarks. And of course to Rob Pascoe, the editor and my long-standing friend. He not only put this book together and brought it to fruition as editor, and I thought it would be useful to have an historian rather than a lawyer to again mark the diversity of the AAL, but he wrote a nice little potted history which recited not only my narrative, but also that of my family and my parents, and put things in a bit of a life context. And I was delighted with that, although he did write one piece which I asked him to take out. That he referred to my late mother as a Catholic grande dame of Perth who made Catholicism respectable. And I wasn't sure.
I still hold that, Bob.
That's the historian's flair for you. One can ask the question, what is the purpose of retired judges' speeches? What service do they do to posterity? Well, Gino has made some useful suggestions in that regard, and I'm delighted to seize them like a drowning man seizes a straw or a life jacket. But I suppose what they do in a historical context is they do provide a little snapshot window to a particular period in history, and and there may be those who are interested to see what were the issues of the day during the period covered by these speeches. And a number of them, of course, reflect contemporary issues of law and justice, our relationships with our Indigenous peoples, and so on, and the intersection between legal education and the law. And of course, that is something which changes from time to time. Concepts of judicial leadership, the role of courts, the boundaries between the courts and the legislature, and how they're conceived at a particular time. There are constants, but things evolve, and we have a moving wavefront. So these capture, I suppose, to some extent, elements of that wavefront of dialogue about the law in which I was engaged, along with members of the Legal Academy and my fellow professionals and fellow judges. So it's a great delight to see it, and Federation Press has done a magnificent job. They are absolutely heroic in their commitment to the publication of works which no sensible commercial publisher would ever touch. And because of that, I have many monographs on my bookshelf, which are extremely valuable intellectual contributions, which have been published by Federation Press and which contribute to the great body of learning and thought about the law and justice in this country that we would never have seen if it weren't for that publisher. So I thank them, and thank them for their continuing commitment. It remains for me simply to thank all of you for your participation and for your contribution, and to thank again the Academy for the great honour that it has done me. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob. And I think I mentioned that that the volume is a handsome one. I don't know that I indicated that it's also pretty hefty. And I figure that if we were not in cyberspace, I would have been able, in the finest naval traditions, to smash a bottle of champagne against it. As it is, all I can do, Professor Delpont, as a bona fide chapette, is declare that the tuning symbol is launched, and thank all of you for participating in this evening's event on Zoom. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Justice Bell. Thank you all for speaking this evening, friends and colleagues. That concludes this evening's event. And again, thank you all for attending.